So hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining from. Thanks for being here to the second World Fair session collocated with the RDA plenary. Those of you joining us from the RDA plenary, thank you for being here. We're delighted that we were able to hold this session as part of the plenary 22. And today we will hear from Simon Hodson and Arfan Gregory from CodeData, the coordinator of the WorldFAIR Project. And they will talk to us about the FAIR implementation profiles, Cross-Domain Interoperability Framework, and some policy recommendations coming out of this project. And our speakers will give you all the details in a few minutes. So again, thank you all for being here. And with that, I will pass on to Simon.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much also to attendees. As Alex has said, we've got 3 topics today. We'll try and accord about 45 minutes to FAIR implementation profiles, another 45 minutes to a presentation on the Cross-Domain Interoperability Framework and discussion of that, and then wrap up with some insight into the policy recommendations. But the latter is very much work in progress. I'm also going to be looking at the attendee list, very anxious. Here's Jill. Fantastic. Hi, Jill. And because some of my co-presenters for the FIPs part will still be joining, but I will share my screen and launch into that presentation. Just a minute. So just bear with me. I'm having a screen issue. Right. Okay, so we wanted to talk about how WorldFAIR has been using FAIR implementation profiles to recount some of our experience with that, to give some insights into what we think we have learned through that process, and to give some insights as to what that's told us about the WorldFAIR case studies, and also to make some recommendations about how other projects and how the community at large, the community of data stewards at large, can use FAIR implementation profiles. Some of you I know, looking at the attendee list, were here yesterday, but I'll run through quite quickly the context of the WorldFAIR project. It's a European Commission-funded project, run for 2 years. It's coming to its end now. The funding from the European Commission was particularly helpful in that we were able to have beneficiaries who were outside the European Union. So we're able to fund partner organizations all around the world, and therefore to have a project that was genuinely global. And you can see from the countries listed how global that is. It's a 2-year project to advance implementations of the FAIR principles in a range of disciplines and cross-disciplinary research areas, and I'll emphasize that as we go on. One of the pieces of thinking of the philosophy, if you like, in WorldFAIR was that in order to advance the implementation of the FAIR principles for particular domains or cross-domain research areas, you need to have involved in that endeavor organizations that play a strong representative role in a particular discipline. Now, that could be international scientific unions. It could be other sorts of organizations or collaborative groups for particular disciplines. It could be research infrastructures. And it certainly needs to include those organizations that look after standards for particular domains. And also international data organizations that work across disciplines like CodeData and RDA can also play an important role. And one of the nice things about WorldFAIR was the collaboration between CodeData as the coordinator and the Research Data Alliance European office, who are hosting us today as part of the RDA plenary meeting. There are links there on that slide as well to our website, the many outputs, and the webinar series, of which there will be 2 more after this date. And this is the slide of thanks to our many partners around the world. I said something about the philosophy. I stress this point a great deal, but I hope it's still useful for an insight into how we're thinking about this. WorldFAIR was designed in the core and in our plan very much as a response to this recommendation from the Turning FAIR into Reality report. And it's a recommendation that I always felt was one of the most important, almost the keystone recommendation for how we implement the FAIR principles. Because it asks and tries to encourage the empowerment of research communities. Research communities need to be supported to develop interoperability frameworks, and we provide a definition of that define their practices for data sharing. How do we do our science? How do we share the data that we produce? How do we describe it? What are the key metadata standards, tools, and infrastructures we use? And this research communities need to be empowered to do that. There's a lot of work to do that in Europe, of course, but this has to be global as well. And some of those metadata standards and terminologies need to, in some instances, do exist on a global scale. But we also need to think about interdisciplinary research. Many of the global challenges that we face in the 21st century are fundamentally interdisciplinary. So how do we address that need? And sometimes we hear this, it's hard enough to sort out and to implement FAIR in a particular domain. How do we do it across domains? And one of the answers to that is that those frameworks should be articulated in common ways, addressing common issues, try to use common languages, and adopt global standards where relevant. And we'll see that very much in our approach to the Cross-Domain Interoperability Framework. This is another statement which I think is important of the role of research communities and those agreements about how we do our science and how we describe our data. And again, the need for convergence across various semantic artifacts. And one of the tools we think for that convergence can be the FAIR implementation profiles. And that's what we'll talk to here. This is a quick mention that the WorldFAIR project didn't come out of nowhere. It was based upon existing work. CODATA was asked by the International Science Council. We're an organization established by the International Science Council specifically to address issues about access and use of data for interdisciplinary research and grand challenge research, things like disaster risk reduction, things like complex issues around population health, things about cities in the modern world from an economic perspective, from a health perspective, from a societal perspective. If we start thinking about those areas of research, they're incredibly complex and they need the articulation and availability of data of many different types. And this is something that we are trying to address in that program and in WorldFAIR, which has become the flagship of that program. But going into WorldFAIR, we had started to develop a methodology, a number of contacts and groups that we were working with. And so the WorldFAIR case studies, which I'll present in a moment, came out of those connections, of that work, and a number of groups that were active within CODATA and in the Research Data Alliance. And that's been a very positive process as well. So here are the WorldFAIR case studies. 11 case studies, and we wanted to explore how each of those case studies could articulate its requirements in terms of how to make data and metadata more fair for the research conducted in that research area, and then to understand what commonalities there were, how we could make recommendations that would work across those domains. So there's an important methodological point there. We wanted to empower each of those case studies to do their work, to make their recommendations for those research areas, but also to try and synthesize, coordinate where we can, and to learn from those outputs and to learn how we could articulate these recommendations in common ways. You can see that that's incredibly ambitious. 11 case studies all around the world, a huge amount of information, a great degree of diversity, but also, I think, a great degree of commonality in terms of the challenges and in terms of the necessary solutions. So one message is that, at the one and the same time, we have a great degree of diversity, but also a high degree of commonality and shared challenges, and to some extent shared solutions. This is a rather simplified summary of our methodology. It was a lot more complicated than that, as you can imagine. It always is. But we set out to use FAIR implementation profiles as a basis for a discussion. How do you make your data and metadata fair? And what tools do you use? In the jargon of the FAIR implementation profiles, what FAIR enabling resources do you use? And what can we learn from that? We also, as Arifan will also say, engage with each of the case studies in what we call a CDIF workshop, an extended long meeting and engagement to understand the data and understand the commonalities, understand how we might tailor CDIF recommendations in such a way as they make sense across domains. And in the end, the outputs from WorldFAIR are a set of recommendations from each case study, the FAIR implementation profiles, and the CDIF recommendations. And this is I'll skip over this slide a little bit, but this is a sort of a narrative of that methodology, and it's something that we want to take forward beyond the WorldFAIR project in WorldFAIR Plus, and to formalize that a bit more in how we deal with case studies, how we engage with particular research areas as an ongoing and further activity to be further refined. But that will be in a continuing initiative that we're calling WorldFAIR Plus. And I'll be happy to answer any questions about it. So that's the context of WorldFAIR. I hope you've got a good understanding of the vision and the methodology and how we approached it. And now a little bit about FAIR implementation profiles, what they are, and what we learned from them. So FAIR implementation profiles, I'm sure many of you know, they've been relatively well socialized now, but they're a methodology developed by the GoFAIR initiative and now being further developed by the GoFAIR Foundation, which is the continuation of that. The light bulb moment for FAIR implementation profiles was in a workshop in January 2019 of the GoFAIR implementation networks, and Eric Schulters was putting together a spreadsheet of what each of the implementation networks was using, and I think had a genuine light bulb moment of, we can start formalizing this to understand how each of these research areas are using various semantic artifacts to make their data and metadata fair. And in the years since, he and Barbara and others have done a lot of work to develop this methodology and the tooling to support it. So something I should say is that I think it was a genuine light bulb moment. I think it is a really good insight in how we can gather information about people's practices. And I think the work that the GoFAIR Foundation have put into this is remarkable and deserves a great deal of recognition. In sum, it's a set of questions relating to each of the FAIR principles and sub-principles, which allow a community, or whatever level we do this, and that's a point of important discussion, to state what resources, FAIR enabling resources, what semantic artifacts or metadata profiles or identifiers, etc., they use to make their data and metadata fair. There's also tooling which allows the outcomes of this responding to the questionnaire to be published as a nano publication, which is a type of RDF with provenance information. And in principle, this could be a really valuable tool to look at commonalities across domains, and, as has sometimes been done, as you can see on the slide there, to create a graph to look at those nodes and connections. We did a first report on our initial experiences, which is linked there. This slide and the next one has a set of links for further information about how a number of the case studies used FIPs. I'll go through this very quickly, but it's just as an example, and I hope this will be of information of use for you for further reading. The social surveys case study used the FIPs to compare practices across the two infrastructures that they were interested in. The ocean sciences case study did a survey of all the FIPs that had been produced up to that stage and used it to identify commonalities as well. So this identification of commonalities and differences is important. The chemistry case study, led by the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry, uses it as a way to explore how they might make IUPAC artifacts more fair. And they produced a couple of FIPs to that effect as well. It was used also to explore fairness in the nanomaterials and nanosafety fields, both in the first report, 4.1, for a specific verification mapping, and in 4.2 for a case study and exemplar of how nanomaterials and nanosafety data might be made fair. Work Package 5 on geochemistry, after reflecting on their practice, presented what really might be called a vision of how fair implementation profiles and fair enabling resources could be published and presented by a research area as a model of good practice and as a way of coordinating activity across repositories. And they recommended that they be conducted, fair implementation profile be conducted at the dataset, data collection, and repository level, and that there's a responsibility on repositories or on other representative agencies to publish their fair enabling resources and their FIPs as a model for the community to help alignment convergence. Work Package 8 in Urban Health used the FIPs as a basis for their guides and training materials for an online resource and training materials and workshops. And again, one of the most interesting uses, I think, was in Work Package 10, the plant pollinator work package, which used the reflection on the fair implementation profile and the content as a rubric for assessment of plant pollinator data and how fair is it. So that's a particular assessment within a particular subdiscipline, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. And now I think at this stage, Isolt, I hand over to you to speak to this slide and the next one. Is Isolt here? I don't see Isolt here. So
I don't have Isolt. Sorry.
You don't have Isolt. Isolt has been very busy. Yes, so I'm sure there's a very good reason for her not to be here. But this is a summary of the WorldFAIR FIPs that Isolt has been working on. And the support that Isolt has given to this process, because she's been engaging with the Fair Implementation Profiles activity, has been really fantastic for WorldFAIR, and we're very grateful to her. But that's the list of the WorldFAIR FIPs. IUPAC, I think they've produced a third one actually as well, but they've done FIPs at different levels, as did the nanomaterials one, and this collection of FIPs from the geochemistry work package. And you can read around. I'll leave that slide as a reference. And this is the analysis of the FAIR enabling resources that are mentioned in those FIPs. At the end of the project, so towards the end of next week, we'll publish the report with these findings and a heat map that Isolt has been preparing to show which FAIR enabling resources are most used across different domains. Now, what I'll do now, Jill is here, even though it's late in New Zealand. Jill, if you don't mind, I'll run through the remainder of this presentation with our recommendations and then hand over to you, I hope, to show some of the visualizations you've been done, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So I'll just finish these conclusions and then hand over to you. So this is the summary of the conclusions and the recommendations that will appear in the report next week. It will be at this DOI, but it's not there yet because we're dotting the I's and crossing the T's, as you can imagine. So beneficial uses of FIPs as didactic tools. And you saw that for the example from Work Package 8 from Urban Health. As useful mechanism for normative declarations of good practice. That's what the geochemists and IUPAC what they felt the use could be. As a basis for targeted, detailed, domain-specific FAIR assessment. All those adjectives are important, and that's the example from the plant pollinators. As a mechanism for identifying commonalities across disciplines. We've all reflected on that. The report from the Ocean Sciences work package is instructive there, and it fed into the CDIF work as well. There's an important role for authoritative organizations to, particularly those that represent particular disciplines or sub-disciplines and that own, in the widest sense of the word, a standard or a terminology or an ontology to publish those things as a FAIR enabling resource, to publish that description so it can be referenced in a FAIR implementation profile. And coming out of the work packages is this vision of a global breadth of FAIR enabling resources and FAIR implementation profiles, which would assist the development and maintenance of good practice. Now, we also identified and are making some constructive recommendations to the community at large and to the WorldFAIR Foundation in relation to FIPs. I need to be clear, we're very supportive of this approach, but naturally constructive recommendations are useful. There's quite a barrier to creating FAIR enabling resources and FAIR implementation profiles. The FIPs wizard, the online tool, is quite nicely constructed, but some people had difficulty both with the terminology and with the interface. It's still not easy enough to do immediate visualizations of FIPs. The tooling is not there. And a number of our work packages felt that they put a lot of effort in, but then where's the information? You can't visualize that as easily as you might like. And it's also an approach that, like many things, relies on a critical mass. Each FAIR enabling resource that's in the system is handcrafted. And yet there are descriptions elsewhere of FAIR enabling resources or things people use to make things fair. And so one recommendation that came from our case studies and that we would like to explore as a community discussion is, can we not integrate the information from FAIR sharing into the FIP system as FAIR enabling resources, encoded in the same way, so that we have a greater number of resources for people to construct their FAIR implementation profiles. And I think that's a conversation that we would like to pursue. And there was also calls for the WorldFAIR Foundation is very committed to the nanopublications approach for some conceptual reasons, because they feel that the provenance information in a nanopublication, which is a type of RDF with provenance, is really important. There were some voices in our project that felt that it was not a very widely used standard, and that a different technical underpinning would better enable community engagement and the development of tools. The WorldFAIR project is not going to make a decision between those two positions. We're going to present that in the report, but ask whether sometime in the near future we can have further discussions to see whether those positions can be aligned. I think this is my last slide before I hand over to Jill for the visualization. Fair implementation and fair assessment. We will make comments about this in another report and in this report. There is a lot of effort being put into fair assessment and fair assessment tools. So much so that Michelle Scoop of the European Commission commented at the EOSC 5-year event in Vienna last year that there are now so many fair assessment tools, we need a tool to assess these tools. It's a priority for WorldFAIR to help research communities to develop and articulate and implement their FAIR practices. And I can see how some of the FAIR assessment tools can help that reflection. But we've long felt that they're missing a trick, and that's explained in that second section on that slide. A lot of the FAIR assessment tools are based upon the FAIR data maturity model, which really asks whether you address a FAIR principle. And it asks sometimes to assess how much. But it doesn't ask which resource you're using to do that. And one of the things that we've always felt was important was to try and understand how people are making their resources fair. Which fair enabling resource, which metadata profile, which terminology is being used, because that's useful information for that particular research discipline. And further to that, a number of the case studies felt that actually that how information is really important. To guide our community, we don't need to ask whether you're using a fair, whether you're making your data fair. We need to understand which metadata profile or standard or terminology is being used, and above all, how is it being used? How is it being implemented? And that's the really important information for the practitioners and the infrastructures and the communities in that domain. And given the level of maturity in many research fields, we do feel that by putting so much emphasis on fair assessment, we've got the cart before the horse, as that image shows. Here are our recommendations, which will appear in the report next week. Provide policy support investment for FIPs, encourage authoritative organizations to publish fair enabling resources, make it easier to do these things, make it easier to visualize fair implementation profiles, explore the wholesale use of fair sharing resources with FIPs, and review the optimal encoding of fair implementation profiles as well. So those are the recommendations that we made, and that's the summary of our use of FIPs. And now, before we move on to questions, Jill will show some of the analysis and visualizations that she's been using. I should introduce Jill Bolland, who's the work package lead of the disaster risk reduction case study in WorldFAIR. She's been fantastic to help us with these visualizations and analysis of the FIPs. And she's coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand, where it's after midnight. So we're very grateful for Jill joining this call.
That's a very nice introduction, Simon. Thank you. Yeah, but it's good to be here. Just share my screen with everybody. Yeah, just let me know. You can all see that, can't you?
Yes.
Okay, and I'll just make it a little bit.
That's perfect, yeah.
So, I have got some visualizations, but I thought I'd just give you like a lightning explanation of what a knowledge graph is, because this is sort of the technology that I've been using to make the visualizations. So knowledge graphs are sort of a type of a database, but really in this database, relationships are the most important thing. So, you know, we have properties and nodes and things that you would normally have in a normal database, but the emphasis is on the relationships. And, you know, it's excellent a way of finding highly connected data and sort of showing the relationships between data. This is the only boring slide I've got, I hope. So this just gives you an idea of what a graph database can. And data is basically, you know, represented in graph format. You have nodes, which I like to think of as nouns or things. So, and they can all have relationships or properties. So this one is sort of a novice person. They've got a name, they've got a date of birth, and they've got you know, some other properties. And you can see these different nodes. And then you have relationships. And I sort of think of relationships a bit more like a verb, I suppose, you know, and so someone knows someone who knows someone else and things like that. So, and these relationships can also have properties. So you can sort of have a bit of a description about the relationship. And the relationship always has a direction, but you can connect to yourself as well. So that's a very quick introduction. And I guess the other thing that you need to know is the best thing, I think, one of the best things about graphs is as long as you're connected in some way to a person, you can find a way through the graph to get there. So as you can see, this guy, Jason, he's not connected to Matthew, but he knows this expert here, and the expert knows Matthew. So we can have an indirect relationship between Jason and Matthew, and we can always find a path through the graph to get through. And so that's the beauty. And then this one, everyone uses knowledge graphs every day because Google is a knowledge graph. And I think this is just a really example of how powerful they are. You can go into Google and just type small green guy with a lightsaber, and within seconds, you're going to get Yoda. Now, you haven't mentioned Star Wars, you haven't mentioned anything about movies or anything like that, but Google still understands that, and that's sort of the power of a knowledge graph. So that's my quick introduction to what knowledge graphs are. And now this is the knowledge graph that I've made for the World Fair and for all of our FIPs. So we've got here, each work package, as you saw from Simon's presentation, has a cluster. I've got here just an example so that you can understand what each one fits to. So we've got a biodiversity cluster, and that's usually 2 or 3 work packages that all share quite similar research areas. Within each cluster, there's the work packages, and each work package has its own name and number. And then each work package has a FIP. Some work package has more than one, but every work package has a FIP. This one here is called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And then these are the FAIR sorry, I've got that wrong. The FAIRs, and these will be like search engines, protocols, all of those different resources that we use in order to source and find our data and store it. And so this one here is the ecological metadata language. And then that one, we've also got we've got FAIR principles, but these are basically for each FAIR element, there's different principles. So this is F2, and this is one of the questions that was used when FAIR enabling resources. I knew that would come to me. And this is an example of one of the questions we use. Which metadata schemas do you use for findability? So it's findability and it's findability 2, and then they're all connected to an element. which we've got the findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So that's the schema of the knowledge graph, and you can see each one of these relationships. So a work package belongs to a cluster, they have FIPs, they use FIRs, and I've put this here as implement. So this FIR helps implement this FAIR principle, and that FAIR principle fits. So this is an example. Sorry, I'm going here. So these are some of the visualizations you can get out of a knowledge graph. I'll just let you all have a look at it because it's quite a complicated one. But as you can see, you can really see all of the relationships that in here. So this is F2, our FAIR principle. And then these here are our different work packages, and these are all from the chemistry cluster. We've got the nanomaterials here, we've got chemistry and geochemistry. And I think this is a very interesting graph. So the things that I really sort of see here is this chemistry one here. It has two FIPs, but really chemistry is not connected as much to the other work packages as, say, geochemistry and nanomaterials are. So chemistry, they've got, these are their FAIR enabling resources here that they use for this FAIR element 2 of findable. And they do have 2 FIPs, but they're not, these FIPs aren't necessarily connected in terms of this principle to the other work packages within their same research discipline. And again, you can see here, this is the nanometer one up here on the left-hand side. I'm sure it's left on yours as well, and it has one FIP that's just connected to one FAIR enabled resource, and that FIP isn't really connected to the other FIPs. But then it has this other FIP, and there's a lot of connection between the work packages. So these ones are all just basically just for that FIP themselves. Sorry, can you see the mouse that I'm pointing with?
Yeah, we can.
Oh, good.
We can, Jill. Yeah, this is this is very informative. It's very interesting. Thank you.
Good.
Yeah, and we can follow where you're pointing to.
Excellent. So yeah, so you can see, so these ones here, these are all from this FIP, and they're pretty much just connected to these ones. But this FIP here, these are all the ones that are shared between work package 5 and work package 4. Again, this one here has a FIP that really only, well, it connects to some of these. Has some, it's not quite as connected. So I just think that's a very interesting one. Within the same research area, you've got FIPs that are much more connected than other FIPs. And this gives you an idea of how they share resources. You know, we can sort of see some that come in a lot, like Dublin Core is something that comes up a lot. DataCite comes up. These have been coloured by the FAIR enabling resource type. Sorry, I'll go back again. So we've got schemas. Some of them are search engines. Some of them are different protocols. So that's just what the colouring there is. So they're different sort of types of FAIRs. So that's that picture. And then I've got this one here. So this one, oh, sorry, I'm really trigger happy tonight. This one here, so this is accessible principle number 2. And again, this I think is quite interesting because you've got quite a few work packages here that all use this RDA CTS. And 1, 2, 3, 4 of these different work packages are using this one for this principle. Remember, it's for this principle. I've had to, there's so many FIRs, which is amazing. I've had to sort of narrow it down a bit, but you know, we could actually do it just for all of the accessible elements, but there'd be a lot on the graph, and it'd be hard for me to explain it all. Again, so this is the ocean science, and they have these FIRs, there's 3, and then you get this big crossover, again, chemistry, which is a really good, they have a lot of crossovers. So all of these ones here crossovers. And this is my work package here, disaster risk reduction. And you can see there's actually quite a lot of overlap, even with the chemistry area. For this, again, for this accessible one, different elements will have different levels and different types of interconnections, I would imagine. And this is my last one to show you. And this is just sort of like this DOI, which you probably all can imagine. This is like obviously one of the most popular ones. Pretty much everyone uses it. So here we can, one of the things we can get from a knowledge graph is you can say which FAIR is used by the most work packages, and you've got this DOI. There's two of them there because one will be a different type. They're different type of FAIRs. So that is the end of those slides.
Thank you very much, Jill. That's fantastic. That's really, really insightful, and we'll get some of those diagrams into that last report. Thank you very much. Leah has pointed out quite rightly that the IUPAC FIP targeted, didn't, how do I express this? It looked at a collection of chemistry resources and how we would make those FAIR. And by resources, I mean the guidelines that IUPAC produces in its color books rather than the data as such. So that's one of the reasons for that disconnect there. And that's because each work package had its leeway to target its activities as it wished. So that, I think, if it was looking at chemistry data, there would be a lot more connections, particularly as we saw that one of the big connectors was INCHI, which is a resource produced by IUPAC or with input from IUPAC, and is widely used. Okay, thank you very much, Jill. I see that Isolt has joined you. Isolt, do you want to say anything about what you've been doing, or I don't know whether you joined by the time that I went through the two slides you added.
Yeah, I just wondered if anybody wants to see, I could share the screen with the table of everything, just to see what it looks like if people just want to have a view of it. But otherwise, I think the key reflections from my side was that, yeah, I think Jill has summarized them very nicely. But what I think the key reflections from my part are that we had different approaches in how we went about it. So, for example, some of the FAIR implementation profiles the communities have declared just one thing for each principle. So whether that was because that's just what they use and they're so well established in that use, or whether it was because there was a misapprehension that, we need to choose one thing and stick with it. Whereas others, I mean, there's some of the FIPs have maybe up to 53 different FAIR enabling resources declared across the 15 principles. So clearly then several of the principles have multiple FAIR enabling resources. So I think as we as communities learn from how we put together our FIPs and how others put together our FIPs, I think there will be a really valuable exercise of just following up on what we have currently got and what we've currently declared, and looking to see what the others have done and went, oh, actually, we either currently use this, but I didn't declare it, or we don't yet use it, but we really should. And I think, from the nanomaterials perspective, things that we learned that we hadn't previously used, where the geosciences have a generic sample identifier that we will now start to use. I wasn't aware of it previously until I was working in NanoFair. And we've also taken in a lot of good things from, for example, the biodiversity community, which are very well established, including things like Provo and provenance ontologies. So I think there is an awful lot of scope to use the work that we've done. And I think there will be an awful lot more analysis that we can do. And, the versions of the FIPs that we have now are just a snapshot in time. All of them will change, all of them will evolve. And we also have identified, you know, so some, maybe I'm not sure that it came through just yet, but we have differences between what's currently in use and what we have declared as for future use. So I think as we visualize some of those, and, you know, when these additional connections come in, there'll be a lot of new important things emerging from that as well. So apologies, I was late. I was running late in another meeting. So
no worries. Thanks for joining. That's great. And yes, I think as you come to the end of a project, you always think of all the things that, okay, this is now a springboard for the things you want to do, as well as things you were able to do in the project. We've got a question from Stian. Stian, over to you.
Yeah, to follow up, thank you all for the great presentations. To follow up on that last point it seems like there's lots of commonalities across the implementation profiles. So it's another next step to extract that, to get kind of fragments of the implementation profiles that can then be combined together, because clearly there's a good benefit to encourage that kind of cross-linking we saw there, and to share experiences and so on. But still, each repository and so on still needs to do their specialization for whatever they do in their domain and so on. So where do we share and develop these kind of joint implementation profiles? Because that's, I think, is where the big power comes, right? Because we don't want just lots of different islands who each do things differently. It's the commonality we need to capture.
I wonder, Simon, if the FAIR Connect wheels might be something that can help in that sort of connectivity between domains and between, you know, where resources are being used by multiple communities, that they might get this FAIR Connect wheel stamp as, you know, multiple communities are using this.
Yeah. I see Alison wants to come in. I'll just sort of give a quick sort of answer from my perspective as well. And this is something that we certainly want to continue looking at in WorldFAIR Plus, in the continuation of the initiative. A lot of this is also to do about the accessibility and the availability of those visualizations, and the slight friction that we've had in being able to produce those. Thankfully, we have Jill, who's helped us with that. But I think it's great to put the information, and it's a good exercise to put information in the FIP, but to be able to visualize those in an easy and accessible way, I think is something that we need to improve. I would very much like to see within the clusters in WorldFAIR us examining those in detail, both within those clusters and across clusters, and getting beyond the obvious ones. Okay, so lots of people are using cross-ref DOIs or data side DOIs. Great. We knew that. It's nice to be able to visualize it. We knew it. Let's move on to some of the more challenging areas where there are tools in particular domains that people didn't realize exist, or approaches that they exist, approaches that are being used in one domain, but which isn't inherently exclusive to that domain. I think we can get a lot of insights from this. And I really hope that we can do that. We can carry on collaborating to do that going forward. Arafat, you wanted to come in?
So, Simon, that was all very positive, and that's good. And Jill, where were those graphs when we needed them, when we were working on these? Come on. That's great stuff. I just wanted to respond to Stian's comment, because don't make the mistake to think that FIPs are sufficient to drive an empirical identification of how people are implementing the FAIRs, because having been through the exercise of CDIF and looking at that stuff, you realize very quickly that the devil is in the details, and you really have to drill into the details to get a feeling for where there is and is not interoperability. Two people can use the same FAIR enabling resource in different ways for different purposes, and that there's a lot of nuance there. So I think it's a great way to guide yourself to the patterns, but there's still a job of analyzing that and also identifying which resources within which domains are actually appropriate, which are the high value FAIR resources. So I think there's a lot of value to the FIPs and to FAIR Connect and so on, but there's still a lot of spade work in there. And I just want to be a little bit cautionary, because that it's complicated, right, as you would expect. And a short survey like a FIP isn't enough research to empirically drive the answer. It just isn't. And you know, you can't expect it to be. I think FIPs are great, but they do what they do and not more. So anyway, Simon, not to rain on anybody's parade, but that's reality.
It gives us an insight into those connections, but something that a number of the case studies mentioned, and which is in this sort of ladder from whether you're using, whether you're making something fair, to which fair enabling resource you're using, to how you're implementing it. There's a sort of a ladder of semantic richness there, if you like, that I think we need to try and keep climbing up with this approach. Any more questions? I don't see any hands raised. There have been some questions in the chat, but I think we've responded to them. Okay, any more questions on FIPs and FAIRs? Not seeing any. We'll transition, and I think Arafan's intervention was a good moment to do that. We'll transition to the second part of this session, which is about the Cross-Domain Interoperability Framework. So, to a significant extent, the engagement with the case studies allowed us to reflect on what would be needed for cross-domain interoperability, the insights from the FIPs, not perhaps in a systematic way, but in an analog way, looking at all the spreadsheets, looking at what came out of them, allowed us to make certain conclusions. And Arafan will now introduce the work on the Cross-Domain Interoperability Framework and where that stands, what that does, and how that's a contribution to discussions about interoperability. Arafan, over to you.
Thanks, Simon. Let me get my screen shared here. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, yeah, see it loud and clear.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about CDIF now, and this is directly related to the work on the FIPs, but comes at it from a slightly different perspective. And I'm not going to go into grim detail in all of this, but I do want to spell out what we managed to cover over the course of the project and what you'll see in the draft that's coming out at the end of the month. Before I do that, though, I really want to I have a perspective slide, as it were, which is this: revolution, evolution, and the hard work of implementation. Because I feel like 10 years ago, the FAIR data principles come out. And that was a real sea change in our awareness of the need for secondary use of data and the sharing of resources in this space. I've been working in standards for 30 years now, and a lot of that time has been spent looking at data archiving and metadata standards, and things really changed when FAIR hit. There's no question about it. That was revolutionary. And suddenly there are resources and people think these are important issues, and the world changed. And when that happened, we've had 10 years now of people coming up with good ideas and evolving the thinking in that space very rapidly. We have things like the FAIR Digital Object Framework. We have all kinds of stuff coming up that's FAIR related. And a lot of that is good research, great ideas. And the problem with ideas is that as long as they remain unimplemented, they're still only ideas. And I think historically where we are now is at a point where, even though it's slow and expensive and painful, we have to implement this stuff because we still don't live in a world where FAIR is a reality. After 10 years of this, the technology, the ideas are there. The question is, how do we bring that to reality? And I feel like that's historically where we are. It's not sexy. It doesn't build your career particularly, but it is necessary. And so CDIF is really coming from that perspective, is what do we have to do now at a detailed level to sort of make this work on the ground? And I think that's an important perspective because I want to talk about what CDIF is and what it isn't. And you've probably picked up by now that it's not a research project. And I can't say that loudly enough. This is not an exploration in what might conceivably work. It's an attempt to create something, to start to create something that will work, that we're trying to do something in reality. And that implementation piece is super important to emphasize. It has to build on existing standards, on existing technology approaches, because even though new things are cool and sexy, they aren't in common use today. And if we want this to be a real working thing, it has to be done with existing resources. It has to be doable. So when we come out with recommendations to implementers that are very detailed, that say implement these profiles of these coordinated set of standards using these technologies, that seems very mundane, and it is, but it's also necessary because that's how we get the machine-to-machine interoperability that FAIR demands. And it is expensive in some ways. There's a lot of metadata in this picture, but at the end of the day, that's what will make that FAIR vision real. And so CDIF is an attempt to come up with that set of coordinated metadata profiles and the sort of technology frame around it that allows machine-to-machine interoperation to work in reality starting today. And like I say, this is a beginning. It's far from complete. It's an 80% effort. We're trying to do some common functions that cross-domain FAIR demands using existing tools and existing standards. And it's not going to work for every case, and it's not going to work for all aspects of FAIR because that's a very, very ambitious goal. But we have to start somewhere. If we don't try, it'll never happen. The thinking behind it is worth looking at. If you go back to the late 80s, early 90s, there were global networks for doing things like making hotel reservations, buying airline tickets, and international supply chain and banking. And those networks really wanted to get away from paper and into a virtual systems, databases. Those industry by industry, they came up with different standards. They internationalized the standards. Every industry went off and implemented those standards differently. And people like IBM Global Services made a fortune mapping dialects between industries. And that model looks like the picture on the left here, is a point-to-point mapping. And it was so expensive. You had people who were charging for doing the mapping and charging to make the network function. It was a terrible model. But they didn't have the web, and we do. And when you think about the web, you have a handful of standards, HTML5 and CSS and so on, that work together, are supported the same way, more or less, everywhere. And the web works, not all of the time, not perfectly, but it works. And it works because you have this sort of common language. And that's a better model in today's world. And that's sort of what we were looking at. In a lot of the discussions in FAIR, people think, oh, we'll just map our standards against your standards and we'll use your resources. The problem is when you try to scale that, it breaks and it's unsupportable in practical terms. So CDIF is predicated on the idea that we can have this lingua franca, if you will, that allows domains most of the time to be able to communicate the core metadata that they need to do some basic FAIR stuff. And in a cross-domain, cross-infrastructure scenario. So that's really what underlies this approach. I want to talk for a minute about the approach to building the cross-domain interoperability framework. We've heard a lot about the FIPs, and obviously we had these 11 case studies in a pretty wide spread of domains. And the FIPs were invaluable here because they described current practice, they highlighted what resources were considered important in the domains, and indicated where the sort of FAIR direction that the domains thought were appropriate. And that was critical input for a reality-based exercise. But we had meetings with each of the case studies to look at some examples of their data and their resources and try to understand in more detail, okay, you say you're using this kind of a FAIR with this kind of information. How does that look? What are you really doing? If we want to recommend some particular approach in CDIF, will it actually work with your data? And so we went through that process with everybody, and Simon showed you the methodology slide earlier. But the other thing that was going on at the same time was that we had working in advisory groups for CDIF. We invited 30 volunteers from different FAIR initiatives and standards and projects, and split them into an advisory group and a working group. And the working group met every 2 weeks throughout the entire project, and more than that, honestly. Unbelievable amount of effort from volunteers and experts in the different areas that we thought were important. and they drafted the specification working group and the advisory group. Okay. I'm getting some crosstalk here. Anyway, the advisory group is more in a review capacity, obviously, and answering specific questions, but that group was really where the CDIF was formulated. So you had two very different perspectives. This wasn't a bottom-up empirical approach. It was a sort of outside-in approach where you had the empirical information from the FIPs and then the working and advisory groups looking at it from a more technical, quote, theoretical FAIR perspective, which I thought was a really good way to work. I want to talk a bit about the initial draft of the CDIF recommendations and what's going to be in it and what's not going to be in it, but that will be coming along in due course. I want to stress the word draft here because this is not a finished product. I think we have enough in the first draft to implement and to do some useful things, but it really isn't a polished output, and we always knew it wouldn't be. I mean, what we told the commission was we will deliver an initial draft, and that's what we produced. It is really a set of core profiles for the highest priority functions to support FAIR, and I'll get into what those are in a minute. We also investigated and discussed a bunch of other areas that we know are very important. And those are also in the initial recommendations, but we don't necessarily make specific recommendations in those areas other than to indicate the direction that the investigation is going. So to highlight the things we're looking into, the things we think are good resources, but not necessarily specific profiles of how they should be implemented. WorldFAIR Plus, which Simon has mentioned, will continue this work. So we're looking at doing more prototyping and exploration of the recommendations we have made in the first draft, expanding the coverage of those, providing recommendations, detailed recommendations where we hadn't in some new areas, and then expanding the coverage of the profiles that we do have. So this is an ongoing thing, and it will be, the development will be ongoing for a while. This is incredibly ambitious, and I think you'll see that when I start showing you the breadth of this. Here's the simple slide. The idea is basically that you have a JSON-LD expression of a number of vocabularies. JSON-LD is brilliant because web developers know JSON. It's just a JavaScript serialization. And RDF, which is really, really valuable for doing stuff with metadata and producing graphs and things, is you get the goodness of RDF in JSON-LD without requiring the developers to be RDF people. And I can't stress how important that is when you're trying to appeal to a broad base of the development community, because honestly, fewer than 15% of them even know what RDF is. It's amazing when you actually look at sort of the surveys they've done in the industry, but everybody knows what JSON is. And so we selected that as sort of the workhorse implementation technology. And the idea is that you embed metadata as JSON-LD in different vocabularies, in landing pages, in standalone files, and we talk in the recommendations about how that metadata is surfaced so it can be found. Things like signposting and different ways of putting this into websites. There are 4 profiles listed here, which are the detailed ones we provide in the spec. Discovery is, and I'll talk more about what these are based on. We are looking at access as an important part of FAIR and machine actionable access, although that's challenging. How do you publish controlled vocabularies and semantics? And how do you describe data? And I'm going to go through those in a little bit more detail and then talk about all the other parts of FAIR that we're looking at that we didn't come up with hard recommendations on. For discovery, we're really looking at, it's a room with 2 elephants in it, I like to say, because you've got schema.org, which is supported by Google, and you can't get away from that. Searching and finding things is incredibly important, and schema.org supports that in a good way. But DCAT is a vocabulary for cataloging data. So it's much better suited to describing things related to data. Both of these have a large installed base. And so what we came up with in the recommendations was to specify a profile of schema.org, which was a core set of things and a recommended set of things for talking about data. And when I say data, I mean static data sets and queryable services, things like controlled vocabularies, although more on the data side than the resources side. But also to point to a mapping of DCAT, because between DCAT and schema.org, because the equivalent in DCAT is at least as valid an approach. And we really see both of those standards as being support is necessary for both of them. When you look at where in the world people are using which of those things, they're inescapable, basically. And I used to have a link to the review draft, but since the full draft is coming out at the end of this month, I've removed it. So you're gonna have to wait till the end of the month to see the specifics here. For access, there's a problem here, which is that even though everyone publishes things like license terms alongside their data now, they do it in completely unpredictable ways. And you know, a document describing your license terms, the text of the license, isn't very machine actionable, but I can't even find that text with the machine right now. So there's some very low-hanging fruit in this area. And there are lots of ways of embedding that into your metadata. So what we ended up doing was going with a W3C spec called ODRL as a framework, not because it's the only way to describe simple things like publishing license text, but because it provides a frame for doing more sophisticated things. The barrier here to doing anything meaningful around access in a machine actionable way is actually the lack of agreed terminology. How do we describe access conditions? How do we describe fair use? And there's a huge amount of work in the FAIR community working on those kinds of vocabularies and agreements, and it is a non-trivial problem space. So what we've done in our recommendations is to say, up to the point where you have a standalone repository that can define those terms for itself, use ODRL to publish that information in the following way, in a standard way. But you can't really get agreements within a network or within registries as opposed to repositories meaningfully that way until we have more agreements. And there's a lot of work, as I say, going on in that space. So we've sort of set the stage for more work there, but we do make recommendations insofar as we can get today. And we outlined 4 scenarios, the first 2 of which we sort of support and recommend and make recommendations about now. Controlled vocabularies are complicated, and I use that term advisedly. It is not, we use it as kind of a generic term for semantic artifacts, but probably that's not technically correct. We're really dealing with 2 things here, SCOS and OWL. So you have formal ontologies described in OWL, and the problem with that is that in some domains, they're very popular, they exist, in others they don't. And so what we're recommending here is that SCOS and XCOS, for those domains where it's used, which is an extended set for doing more formal classifications, be the lowest common denominator, as it will. It's always possible to reduce a formal ontology to a view of it using SCOS. The reverse is not true in a practical sense. So we discussed those 2 standards and basically recommend the use of SCOS for concept systems and the controlled vocabularies that are used in data description, which is a very narrow application of what SCOS is capable of doing. But when you're adding semantics in a data description, you need to have a standard way of talking about them and a way that isn't prejudicial to any particular domain. SCOS achieves that. OWL is much richer. You can connect the SCOS to the OWL to leverage that richness. And we hope that people do that, but we can't demand that people do that. Formal ontologies are serious business, and not everybody's ready to do that. But we do talk about that relationship in CDIF. Data description gets really, really serious because it's very metadata intensive. When we say data description, we're not talking about cataloging information. That's more the discovery end of it. We're talking about describing the variables, the fields within the data. We're talking about the semantics used to represent the meanings of the fields within the data. There's a lot of metadata here, and it's very granular. The range of ways in which people present data for use in FAIR is very, very broad. And the range of standards that are able to describe that breadth is very, very limited. In CDIF, we talk about what we looked at and what the choices we made, but we came down ultimately to DDI CDI, which was a standard kind of designed for this purpose. And we're limiting ourselves to describing text-based formats, basically. So there's an awful lot of data we can't describe in this way, but most data ends up being disseminated for FAIR purposes in a CSV or similar kind of format. So that's what we focused on. Our data description is the structural description with links to the semantics in the controlled vocabularies. for things like the meanings of variables and representations. We do not describe the process of integration at this stage, although that's important, especially as you get into provenance. We're really talking about making your data sets integration ready, if that makes sense. We also give some links to tools that show how it's possible to generate sort of a minimum structural metadata description according to the CDIF recommendations, because it's not impossible to do, but the tooling really helps. To inform all of these profiles, we also have to talk about the universals, time, geography, and units of measure. And that's, again, still a work in progress, but we've tried to lay out the basics there. I want to talk a little bit now about the additional topics. These are things we discuss in the text, but that we do not go into a lot of detail for, and for which we're not making detailed recommendations yet. This is not to say that they aren't critically important to FAIR, because I think all of them are, and some more, some less. But we simply need to have more work. We need to pay more attention to what's going on in the community as practice emerges. So there, for different reasons, we didn't necessarily go the full distance in all of these. Provenance is the big one. Describing process is critical to FAIR in so many different aspects of FAIR. We really need to be able to know what happened to the data. Where did it come from? Who did what to it? And that impacts its usability. How can it be accessed? Can you replicate findings? On and on and on. There are all kinds of implications for this information. And there are a lot of approaches to describing it. Something that we've realized, and this comes out of another FAIR initiative. I think, Stian, you were involved in this. I think you actually told me about this. There's this idea of chaining process steps to create a full data lineage. And this is a problem that hasn't really been solved yet, but everyone thinks, oh, I get inputs, I do some work on them, I process them, I analyze it, I produce an output. Describe that, there's my provenance. But the truth is that one effort's outputs become the inputs to the next stage. And we need to do this multiple step data lineage if we really want to describe provenance. There are a lot of standards here. Many of them are prov oriented, like the CDI process model, like prov1, SDTL, SDTH, and some not. I think the common workflow language is used a lot, but it's not prov based. And there needs to be some rationalization and exploration and discussion there to determine a good practice, if you will. They're all pretty similar, though, I will say that. So that's a huge area of work. Very related are a couple of other areas. One of these is describing data integration, because there is a process aspect to that. But there's also this need for semantic mapping and structural mapping. One of the things that seems to be surfacing a lot is SSSOM, which is a simple way of mapping ontologies that gets used a lot, coming out of Obo Foundry, I believe. But we know that it's insufficient to the full needs of data integration, but it's a starting point. There's actually a new RDA group on FAIR mappings that came out of some of the other FAIR initiatives in this space. And our intention in CDIF is to align with that work. So in some ways, we're a little bit in wait and see mode, knowing that SM will be important, but knowing that there will be some other things there as well. There's a lot of work in EOSC and FAIR mappings, for instance. Again, related but non-identical to provenance is the idea of data context. And there are really two big areas here. One of them is what I call variable dependencies, which is where you have fields within your data that have very serious dependencies between them, relationships, but ones that are non-obvious, that aren't reflected in the structure or the definitions of the independent fields. And we have standards like RDA IADOPT, and you see some of this in OGC's observations and measurements. There are models for describing these things, and they can be implemented in a data description like in DDI CDI anyway. And we've started looking at how that can be done, but there are still some open questions there. And that's something that we need to do more work in. Completely unrelated to that, but very important, is to get a clear picture of the different things in the research picture and how they relate. I'm not even sure you can describe provenance meaningfully without more clarity here. What is a sample? What are events in the real world? What are observation events? How do these things relate to the data that's collected? How is the processing of that data related to that cluster of things? There's some great work came out of the World Fair, and this was cross-case study, looking at some of these things. And there's a paper, I believe, that's going to be published, hopefully, in the not too distant future. But again, lots of questions here, but we need that background about the data for cross-domain use, because It's implicit in a lot of domain knowledge and not in a cross-domain scenario. You have to be explicit about this. And we need some agreements about how we're going to talk about it. There's more. Okay, the obligatory chat GPT slide, as someone called it. What about AI? There are some really interesting developments. I don't know if people have followed Croissant GL, but Google and some other people have produced a very lightweight metadata structural description of data sets for training large language models. And when I took at first glance, what we have in CDIF would allow you to produce Croissant instances quite trivially, actually, like the alignment is good. Maybe that's not as true as I hope. But there are some points of contact with the kinds of developments in the AI world that we'll need to stay current with. But the reverse is true as well. How do we describe the provenance, the process involving a black box like a language model? I don't know if people how into this people are, but there's an idea that within a language model there are what they call features that light up depending on the prompts which are being processed. And there are ways of tracking this stuff that are emerging. I don't know enough about it to be an expert for sure, but I do know that there are some developments in the space that we might be able to leverage if we can get the right expertise. There's a lot of stuff about AI that we need to pay attention to because we've been blindsided a little bit by the technology, but we still need to track the provenance. We still need to know that access and use is being done legally, as well as maybe being able to better support the use of some of these language models with structural metadata with semantic richness, reduce the hallucination factor. So this is a two-sided coin, if you will. We know that we don't have answers here yet. Something that I didn't want to leave out of this is RO crates, because you see RO crates getting used everywhere. There is always a need for packaging, for archival packaging, for dissemination packaging, for pulling together sets of data and metadata that need to be used together. In some ways, we can think of RO crates as an implementation of the FDO framework, if you will. So I don't know what to say about this, and we haven't looked at this in depth, but we know there are requirements in the packaging space, and this begins to get you into the repository world a little bit, which again is something that we haven't approached in the initial round of CDIF, but we know that that's an important area and a standard that we're going to be looking at. My last bullet here is about additional data formats. There are lots and lots of ways of formatting data that aren't text-based. And we know that CDIF is limited in its initial draft. Things like NetCDF are everywhere, and there are many different flavors of NetCDF. What about Parquet? Things like HDF5. How do you describe data that's been put into a graph and described in RDF, XML? There are lots of these different expressions of data that we may or may not be able to describe with the current recommendation. And we know that we need to expand recommendations in that direction. So that's it for the topics that are addressed in the initial draft to one extent or another. I want to talk a little bit, I mentioned reality at the beginning of this talk, and part of that is getting adoption and starting to prototype some of what's in the recommendations. This is just a smattering of examples. I think there are really three pillars to this. One is to try to build on existing networks. Work Package 11 in FAIR was the Ocean Data Information System, which is a brilliant large-scale knowledge graph built on a very thin veneer of discovery metadata in schema.org using JSON-LD encodings. And that was one of the big examples that led to our recommendations in CDIF. It's brilliant when you see it working, and it doesn't cost the participants that much, but you have 200 some odd big organizations contributing to this one very large knowledge graph. It's very impressive. How about we connect that oceans data with other related data like economic data, like other kinds of data that might be in, say, the Pacific Hub, where people are very concerned about what's going on in the ocean for all kinds of reasons. And there's some ideas about how we could extend that kind of a knowledge graph approach and do some really powerful things with it. And I think the CDIF recommendations would be one way of supporting that kind of functionality. So we're looking at those kinds of projects. A lot of collaboration with the official statistics community around controlled vocabularies. They have there's an emergent use of SCOS coming out in things like VocBench from Eurostat and FAO Caliper. The UN Statistical Division is looking at this. And we want to work with them to create sort of an alignment between the official statistics world and the research community in how we publish controlled vocabularies, focusing first on SCOS, which seems to be the commonality there. Again, you could get them to pick up that profile, and suddenly there's a lot of that specific stuff in the world. I'm mentioning Helmholtz and NFDI. There's a bunch of different projects that are being considered in different networks. I like the Helmholtz one because I knew nothing about X-ray absorption spectroscopy, and we put together a bid trying to describe that data in CDIF. And we don't know whether that will be accepted or not, but I know, Rolf, you were on the call. You were the inspiration for that. But it's really good to try CDIF out in domains that weren't part of WorldFAIR and to see whether the fit will work, basically. We're also looking at high-value data. The SDG indicator disaggregations, they had a project putting them into Google Data Commons, and they identified CDIF as a way to take their SDMX stuff and better talk about those disaggregations. And so they prototyped a service that mines standard SDMX web services, and they started at ILO, but they would work in any of the SDMX web services, and generates a CDIF data description. And they're using that as the bridge into Google Data Commons. There are some really interesting prototypes like that out there, and with high value data like the SDG indicators. And that kind of stuff could help people adopt CDIF because they can see that it has some utility and utility with kinds of data they care about. As one example of tools integration, we're talking a lot with Dataverse. They support SCOS with plugins. They support a lot of the AI developments. They support DDI Codebook for social data. They're a good platform for standard use. And so we're going to be talking to them about providing support also for the CDIF profiles. And we've invited one of their head engineers to a workshop this fall to look into that. And there's some other initiatives I won't talk about, but there's a lot going on in this space. And my last slide. Ultimately, we need to do a much better job of supporting implementers. We have the CDIF initial draft is north of 130 pages of PDF right now. It's a really long document, and that's great. You have to deliver something in a comprehensive format to the commission. But in order to expect people to work with the information in there in a more realistic way, we need to make it easy to use. So we need to boil the profiles down into sort of step-by-step how-to instructions, provide more code examples. We have a GitHub repository. We need to start using that more, and to provide an easier way to navigate the recommendations and understand what's being said, basically for everybody. There's been a lot of discussion about how we might use things like Shackle or the profiles standard coming out of W3C now, so that people could test conformance, put up a website. You could take your instances, point to them and say, is this or is this not conformant with this profile? Better documentation on sort of what the recommendations are and what they mean specifically. So there's a lot of work we have yet to do in the immediate term to make this a practical reality for implementers. But the point is that the initial draft contains the gist of it. And that's my last slide. So I'm going to stop now. And it looks like we have some comments in the chat and probably some questions.
Yes, thanks very much, Arafan. That's great. I don't see, please, colleagues, raise your hands if you'd like to ask a question. I will try and pass the chat. So it's mostly comments rather than questions on the chat that probably don't need particular emphasis. Really, people noting links or parallel work. For example, Barbara has noted OGC and iAdopter collaborating to get it into the extension of the ONS standard. That's, I think we are aware of that, but that's useful to know. Common workflow language comment from Stian. Stian's have to leave the meeting. Our related manner publications is fair packaging. Yes, there's FDOs. We're aware of that. Okay, any questions or any more comments? A lot of information there. We hope people have this idea of that CDIF is trying to address at the, both in the initial draft and in the future work, core functional requirements of making data and metadata fair, and really how to turn that, how to take a practical approach.
So we have a question from Steve, Simon.
Mm-hmm.
And Steve's asking a hard question. And I know Steve, and I know that he's a social scientist, and I know what a sample is to a social scientist. And that's pretty different than what it is to, say, a geochemist. Okay. So Steve, there has been a lot of work done trying to look at what a sample is when in relation to data. And that question gets very complicated. I think you were aware of some of the discussions at Dagstuhl last year, although you weren't maybe in the room. We do not have a single, I would not presume to say that I could define what a sample was across domains at this point. That said, there is a lot of very interesting work looking at the way in which samples are considered domain by domain and where those things are common. The group that was looking at this, and some of the people are on the call here, Isolt, Leah, I think we have the cultural heritage people here, right? Are they still in the room?
Yeah, Beth is here, and she's mentioned this in the chat as well, that there's going to be a related session of Deepesh. So
I know, Kirsten, we were talking about the sample identifiers and that you're very keen on that. You run into some really, really dangerous issues, because when you get into things like units of measure are based in physical reality, like BIPM, and in social science, you're not measuring physical things. And so you immediately start getting into these conflations of the idea of what's a variable, what's a complex unit of measure, what is a quantity, what is a sample as opposed to data. And those discussions have been ongoing, Steve. I'm not going to say we have definitions or clarity. I think we're closer than we were 2 years ago. To my mind, that's one of the most interesting parts of this, but it is still very much exploratory. So I don't know. I think that this is a discussion that needs to continue, and ultimately is going to inform how we deal with provenance, how we deal with the context of data, how we deal with making data really usable, with things like IADOPT. Exactly, Barbara. So I'm going to stop there, Steve, but that's an endless topic. Do I think there are similarities between sampling methods in social sciences and the physical sciences? I actually think there are. It's some very, very basic ways. And those are patterns that are important to us. But, there are also a lot of very specific things, domain by domain, that you can't ignore. So,
thanks. Any more questions? There's a discussion in the chat about samples, but I'm looking to, I think that's comments rather than questions. Anyone has a further question, please raise your hand. Put it in the chat. I hope everyone's got a mental picture now of what CDIF will contain in terms of profiles. So that's a very reasonable core at this stage.
Sorry, I don't know how to raise my hand. Can I ask something?
Yeah, go ahead, Barbara.
Is there somebody working on smart protocols and method descriptions? Because, well, in RDA, we are working on this now as a separate activity apart from IADOPT. Just wanted to be aware what's going on. And also, when you talk about profiles, you don't mean FAIR implementation profiles, right? Or are you talking about that?
No, that's right, Barbara. The FAIR implementation profiles are their own thing. When I'm talking about profiles, I mean a subset of the available fields in a given specification.
Yeah, okay.
And modifications. So something that's not mandatory in the spec, you might require, or you might say, okay, you can use an identifier, but it has to be a URI, right?
Yeah, okay.
And those kinds of things are what I mean, profiles in the ISO sense, I guess.
Yeah, okay. And the other question?
In terms of methods, I've noticed that whenever people start talking about methodology, all progress stops.
Yes.
Methods is a really hard area and something that we've avoided at this point. You can't ignore methods. You have to document them. there's a lot of work in different domains being done around methods. I feel like that's an open area that is not a roadblock to enhancing our position in FAIR. That said, methods are important. Having a description of methods is important. Going cross-domain with that is extremely complicated. And I think any work that can be done in that area is something we should pay attention to. So I just think it's a real minefield, and that we've got to try to be practical about how we approach these things, not that methods aren't important. I think the work in iAdopt obviously begins to point in that direction, because you have methods that privilege certain kinds of things and certain kinds of data that need to be collected according to certain patterns. And that I would love to be able to describe that in a good generic way and share that with the users of the data, but we're not quite there yet, if that makes sense. Basically, you point off to the article and say, read that, and then you'll understand what I did. And
well, we are trying to verify or try to approach this topic. I agree, it's completely difficult and a lot to do.
I went to Eurostat once and I asked them if they had a catalog of methods, just the statistical agency, so not hard science at all. And they had 1,500 pages of catalog of standard methods. 1,500 pages. Cataloging methods is not necessarily a useful activity if what you're looking at is interoperability. Having a generic model for describing the ones used, probably more useful in a cross-domain scenario, right? So it's, like I say, I think it's a minefield. That's something that we do need to look at, though. So it's a good question, and I'm happy to hear that people are looking at that. But good luck with that. Is that job security, Barbara, in any sense? Because that work could go on for a long time, even in RDA.
This is only volunteer work, so that's my RDA engagement.
Is it an interest group at this point, or is it more serious than that?
No, yeah, well, we have a few people working on this around ELTER and also around the oceanographic group, the NERC people. Okay. Serious work.
Thanks. And I think that conversation should continue offline as well. Any further or final questions? There's generally a tool at the bottom of the screen in Zoom to raise your hand, or you could put a note in the chat.
And I think, did someone put a link into the draft that
not to the draft, and I hope not, but there are links to various documents related to it, and definitions of samples. The draft is very much a work in progress, so it would be premature to link to that at this stage.
Yeah.
Okay. This isn't Barbara, there aren't common notes. This is a side meeting. And it's really very much a presentation about WorldFAIR. Okay, so seeing no further questions, I will, the last item in the meeting, I'll give a very quick presentation to give some insight into our policy recommendations. So we're required by the Commission to produce a policy brief, but it's something that we want to do in any case. A lot of recommendations, both policy and technical and organizational in particular, have come out of the WorldFAIR project. We're doing a lot of work at the moment to synthesize those and to present those. I think they will be of interest to particular research disciplines. In particular, if that is your research discipline, these are things that colleagues in WorldFAIR have said. And I think they're interesting to consider across disciplines as well. That's been very much the ethos of the WorldFAIR project, of what we can learn across disciplines. And we've heard, I think, some of the learnings that we've had, and you've heard also, I hope, got an insight into how much we think we could still keep learning, whether that's from FAIR implementation profiles or discussions of what a sample means, or how we document the crucial things that come out of a methodology and a process that need to be documented in the data in order for those data to be used effectively in science or to be processed at scale by machines. So we're pulling that together, and there will be, we published a policy brief just over a year ago, and there'll be a second one published next week as well. And this is an intro. The arguments will continue, they'll expand. I think we're confident that a lot of the arguments we presented in that first policy brief remain things that we want to say. So I'll talk a bit about those, but please keep your eyes peeled for what comes out at the end of the project as well. One of the things that we argued in that policy brief is that we need to transform about how we think about data insights. Looking at the WorldFAIR case studies, I am quite astonished how many research areas spend a huge amount of effort extracting data post facto from academic articles. In biodiversity, in the pollination, in nanomaterials, and in geochemistry, I could have put there as well. Once again, cart before the horse. The data should be part of a common resource. We've got our colleagues at GBIF producing over, I think Joe said yesterday, over 3 billion facts about biodiversity. Still, many of those are being extracted from articles and then going into GBIF rather than going directly into GBIF as data. And it just seems in a world that's increasingly aware of the importance of data for science, for research, that's increasingly savvy about how to look after data, we should be putting the data first in many respects, getting the data directly into GBIF and then doing the research rather than packaging it in a PDF and then spending even more money to extract it. And also a lot of our thinking about how we put data in repositories, how we look after it, is still on a bibliographic model. We get a data package, we give it a small amount of extended doubling core, and we expect people to download it. We're not engineering the data. We're not describing the data in the way that Arafan has discussed in CDIF so that those data can be effectively combined with other data. We're expecting research projects to download those data, to do all the data cleaning, to combine them themselves, and then to do the research. And this is why we have factoids like that presented in the PwC report a few years ago, about 80%, an estimate of 80% of research effort going into data cleaning, data wrangling, rather than the analysis itself. Parsons and the late lamented Peter Fox published an article just over 10 years ago now. Is data publication the right metaphor? I think it still has a lot of wisdom in it. And one of the arguments we make is we need to shift from this bibliographic approach to a data engineering approach. We need to do that because data supports important areas of research. So the argumentation will go, what sort of data do we need for the research we need? How do we engineer, how do we put that in place? And how do we provide research infrastructures with the tools to provide researchers with the data they need, rather than the sort of cottage industry approach that we have now. So this is this idea of data products. So if we persist with the bibliographic model, if we just think about describing things with DC and having it being downloaded, we will not achieve the Web of Fair Data and Services that the European Open Science Cloud claims to achieve. And there are at least 3 drivers for this, which we think are very important. We stress 2 of these in the first policy brief. We'll stress a third, which Arafan's alluded to in the second. Interdisciplinary grand challenge research, we've mentioned that a lot in WorldFAIR, fine-grained management of data access, transparency, validation, and reproducibility in the context of AI readiness and responsible AI. And as has been hinted at, we can learn a lot from collaborative global data platforms which have that integrative approach as part of their missions. Things like GBIF, which were a partner on WorldFAIR, things like ODIS, which was a partner on WorldFAIR, things that Arafan has mentioned, the SDG Data Cube and SDMX. So this is sort of a very high-level summary of those recommendations. We need to have an international dimension. I think WorldFAIR, one of the very useful things that we've shown, and it's good to talk about this in the context of the RDA plenary, is the international dimension is essential. There is a lot of work going on, a lot of good work going on, of course, in Europe. But we mustn't be Eurocentric or Northern-centric about this. I think anyone that attended the WorldFAIR session yesterday will have seen how valuable the input that we've had was from the plant pollinator work package led from Brazil, by the population health work package, which was doing its work in Eastern and Southern Africa, by the urban health work package, which, although it was a US institution, was a pan-Latin American project. I think that's something that we've shown in WorldFAIR, that global dimension, and a corrective to sometimes a Eurocentric approach. Cross-domain research is essential for scientific international strategic priorities, and therefore, if we accept that, we need to accept that we need to do the work with the data and the metadata. I've mentioned a number of times the important role of authoritative organizations. I know some colleagues don't like that term authority, because people don't like being told that someone has authority and can tell other people what to do. What we mean by that is that there are organizations which have a legitimate role representing a community, and that's long-standing. And many of those organizations are a focal point for community decision-making about methodologies, about nomenclature, about terminologies. And as soon as we're talking about that, we're also talking about data. So organizations like IUPAC, collaborative organizations like not really an organizations, initiatives like One Geochemistry, these things are really important. And I think they deserve the name authoritative organizations or initiatives, and they have a role in publishing their enabling resources, in creating FIPs as models and as examples to their community. Please pay attention to the Cross-Domain Interoperability Framework. It's a huge undertaking. We're going to publish, as Arifan says, the core recommendations and really what amounts to a roadmap for future work. That work will continue, but please collaborate with us. We'd like to expand the working group and expand that initiative post WorldFAIR. And to repeat the shift from bibliographic to engineering approach from data stewardship. Please do have a look at the arguments that were in the first policy brief. Many of those will reappear and will be a little bit refined in the next one, which will appear at that DOI by the end of the month. But don't click on that DOI yet, because there is nothing there yet. And finally, I want to end with something that's been mentioned. I put some information in the chat. Arifan mentioned this as well, WorldFAIR Plus. As I mentioned, from a co-data perspective, and with a number of our partners and colleagues on the project, this was a wonderful opportunity to advance some work that was already underway and will continue. So CDIF will continue. Under the working title WorldFAIR Plus, we want to carry on coordinating a set of activities, including CDIF, a number of case studies. We hope to carry on collaborating with the existing case studies and to welcome some new ones. CoData will carry on that coordination, but it won't be a single project as WorldFAIR was. It will be a set of parallel projects. We have some funding already for new case studies and emergencies, and we have the likelihood or possibility of funding for a number of others, which are listed on that slide. And we're in discussion with a number of partners for how we can continue this as a global initiative, as a set of collaborations. So we're not waiting for one particular piece of funding to do a WorldFAIR 2, as it were, although we will be exploring any opportunities for that. We will be carrying on from the 1st of June with what we call WorldFAIR Plus, which is a coordinated set of parallel activities to continue the work. That includes CDIF, and that includes continuing to explore the use of FAIR implementation profiles and the work with case studies. And that, I hope, is a useful conclusion to the session to indicate our policy recommendations and next steps. If there are any more questions on that, please let me know, raise your hand or indicate, pop something into the chat. Please do get in touch if you're interested in collaborating on WorldFAIR Plus, and please watch this space for the WorldFAIR deliverables.
Simon, there was a question or two about the availability of recordings after this event and also the slide decks.
Yeah, so the slides will all be shared. We'll put those into a Google Drive and then request that you and Alex coordinate putting those on the WorldFAIR website. And yes, everything will be made available for the session via the WorldFAIR website.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. People are saying thank you. I think some people have RDA sessions to get off to. We're very grateful for your attention and for your input. Please be in touch if you have any further questions, and watch the space for the deliverables. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.